English language digest of the Kaleidoscope podcast, your source for inspiration. Just like a kaleidoscope, which creates ever new changing forms and mirroring patterns, in the Kaleidoscope podcast, different viewpoints and perspectives, different thinkers and experts are brought together in new ways. In the English digest, we pick up on some of the ideas and reflect on them for our non-Yemeni listeners. Our aim is to inspire you to think beyond boundaries, to look at issues from new angles, and to integrate new ideas into inspiring, innovative solutions. Don't forget that you're part of this kaleidoscope, and sharing your thought is important to us. Contact us after each episode on social media or at contact@yemenpolicy.org.
Welcome to the 6th episode of the Kaleidoscope podcast. In this podcast, which will talk about the future political dialogue in Yemen, necessary for a sustainable peace process, we welcome two guests, specialists with a wealth of expertise on Yemen and its granular details. First, we welcome Nadwa al-Dawsari. Nadwa is a political and conflict analyst and a non-resident scholar at the Yemen Gulf Program in the Middle Eastern Institute in Washington. And she's worked for over 20 years in conflict and peace affairs in Yemen and the region. And together with Nadwa, we welcome Mr. Mohammed Al-Qadhi, who also has worked as a front-line war journalist as well, and as an analyst with expertise in the Yemeni affairs. Very happy to have both of you aboard. Welcome to today's discussion. In the first section, we'd like to explore, the obstacles to the resumption of the dialogue between Yemeni parties. Nadwa, if I may begin with you, what are, the three key obstacles, though these obstacles actually might be more than that, but what are the key three obstacles that prevent the resumption of genuine, constructive dialogue to resolve this, protracted conflict 7 years on? Over to you, Nadwa.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be in this podcast with you and with my old friend, Mohammed Al-Qadhi. So the dialogue and the obstacles, the conflict in Yemen has gotten much more complex than when it started in 2014. And there are many obstacles, serious obstacles to genuine peace talks. First of all, you have the Houthis on one hand, who have gained substantial, significant military power and made significant military gains since they took Sana'a in 2014, to the point that they feel they don't have to compromise. Not that they were interested in compromising in the first place, but being probably the most successful military power in this conflict, that further emboldens them. But more importantly with the Houthis is their political ideology, which does not really encourage genuine engagement in political talks. The Houthis' political ideology relies on one main principle, which is the divine right to rule. Houthis think that they have a divine right to rule the country, and maybe more. And they also believe that God is on their side and that they are on a sacred mission. And so it's hard to dialogue with that. It's hard to have any, back and forth with that kind of mentality. It is an obstacle, and they do believe that they will win, and they will take Yemen and probably push north into Saudi Arabia. So that's one obstacle. But on the other hand, you also have the anti-Houthi forces. You have the Yemeni government, you have the Southern Transitional Council, you have the Tariq Saleh forces in the West Coast. But even outside these groups, you have other groups as well. And the problem with the anti-Houthi forces that are mainly, backed by the Saudi-led coalition, by the Saudis and the Emiratis, is that they are not in agreement with each other. In fact, they're fighting each other. You have the Yemeni government and the Southern Transitional Council fighting each other in the south. You have the Tariq Saleh forces in the West Coast, which is not really, in good terms with the Yemeni government. And so all these divisions within the anti-Houthi forces allowed the Houthis to create a vacuum in which Houthis was able to expand. But more importantly, the backers of these forces, the Saudis and the Emiratis, have divergent agendas. The Saudis do not really have leadership in terms military leadership and also diplomatic leadership. And if they have, it's not really effective. The Emiratis have effective military, capabilities, and they were on the ground since 2015. But the Emiratis' objectives in Yemen are different from the Saudis. The Emiratis' objectives is one, to undermine Islah, which is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Emiratis believe, or they sanction them as a terrorist organization. And so the Emiratis have redirected their focus from defeating the Houthis to exterminating Islah. And Islah is one of the major forces, if not the major forces, that are fighting the Houthis on the ground. And so that these divisions and these divergent agendas between the backers of the anti-Houthi forces have all created a situation where the anti-Houthi forces are fragmented and fighting each other, which played into the hands of the Houthis militarily. So which is why the Houthis have gained so much since 2018. They've expanded so much, and they're now threatening Marib, which is the last stronghold of the government. About a month ago, they also expanded into Shabwa, into the south, for the first time since 2016. So you have a situation where the Saudi-led coalition has intervened militarily, but no military strategy, no plan. I can describe the military operations in Yemen as flip-flopping. One day they push the Houthis out of certain areas, and then they stop, and then the Houthis take those areas and more. So the military situation is not conducive to political dialogue, because the Houthis think that they're winning, and the other side is not doing what it takes to weaken the Houthis enough to force them to come to the negotiation table. And you have all these anti-Houthi forces that are, you need a dialogue between these forces before we engage in a dialogue with the Houthis. So it's a really, really complex situation. And it doesn't seem that any of the parties have an interest in peace. So that's why we're in this situation. That's why the political negotiations have hit a wall.
Thank you very much, Nadwa. So you mentioned multiple reasons to why, peace talks or consultations or dialogue generally hit a wall or reached a stalemate. The scale of complexity seems just too complex to be unpacked at once. You mentioned, the proliferation of armed groups who are fighting each other in the anti-Houthi front, as opposed to the Houthis being able to consolidate power since they eliminated their one-time ally, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and then eventually expanded immediately after the Stockholm Agreement in 2018, and then expanding all the way to Jof by 2020 in the spring, and then all the way, to Shabwa, as you highlighted, in recent months, and the southern area of Marib, both of which were mostly recaptured in recent weeks. And all of this escalatory terms do not pave the way for genuine resumption of the peace process, as you pointed, at least any soon. Mohammed, if we go and ask you the same question, actually, in terms of the three obstacles that hinder the resumption of peace talks, what would you name? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for having me in this podcast, and it's a pleasure to be part of it with my friend Nadwa. In addition to what Nadwa said, I think in the course of the war, we have seen a growing war economy, which is one of the most important obstacles now before any peace talks, or before seriousness. To go to peace. There are now groups on both sides who have profited from this war and who established their own businesses out of this chaotic situation, absence of accountability. So there are groups, both sides, are making use of the black market in fuel, in money dealing and other sources of income. All these are encouraging different actors here or there to be reluctant, to go to peace, and they're going to be one of the most challenges, of course, before any attempt, to move forward towards real talks and peace negotiations. I have been watching this since I was reporting from the ground, from the front lines in Taiz, and I was all the time. I used to be called by foreign analysts or diplomats. I was warning from the very beginning since 2016 that there is a war economy that is in the making, and it's going to be a real challenge and a real problem, in addition to what was also in the making, which is the culture of war. So this is one of the most important challenges and problems. In addition to what can be seen, the influence of the regional powers on the local actors. So many people are talking about a proxy war, which is not really true, because there are some roots for Yemen conflict. There are some genuine reasons for what is happening on the ground. It's not completely a proxy war, but still the influence of the regional powers on the local actors, which has been emboldened, and it has broadened in due course of the war, is also another element that can be a big challenge or a real problem for any real negotiations. And you can see now people are talking and making links between the situation in Yemen with what is happening now in Vienna, in the nuclear program of Iran, how it is associated with what is happening. You can see how people are talking now after this recent escalation between the Saudis and Emiratis of some shuttle diplomacy for some regional actors. So it's all linked and interrelated, and for this, it's not a pure Yemeni conflict now, but it has its own dimensions regionally and maybe internationally. So it's also another element that adds fuel into the fire of the Yemeni conflict and make it also more sophisticated and more difficult to approach without such consensus among regional powers. It's very important. I understand that it is Yemeni conflict and it is Yemenis who should handle it, but unfortunately, some or maybe all Yemeni local actors being used in a way or another by regional actors in a way that is not that is really shameful, for us as Yemenis.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You mentioned a set of complementary points to actually just illustrate how complex it is to resume dialogue, which is actually sounds like doom and gloom, but I hope it is not. So you mentioned divergence of interests. You mentioned the regionalization of the conflict, that the Yemen file hasn't become only a Yemeni file, but it is as much an Iranian file, a Saudi file, and an Emirati file. It's become a file for all, interested stakeholders in the region and even beyond, which of course doesn't make things easier. And you also talked about issues like accountability and the black market and the war economy, which puts less incentives for actors who are actually benefiting and making profits from the suffering of the people. So on the scale of incentives, it seems like there should be more incentives from peace in financial returns or in power returns for these groups to actually rethink their options. And that's all interesting. Although, it sounds like the assumption of dialogue between Yemeni parties is going to take some time. But if something magical would happen, that the conditions have changed. The military imbalance that Nadwa highlighted has changed in favor of, the side who favors more human rights, democracy, respect of human lives, equal citizenship, justice, and a Yemen for all. What would you like, or how would you conceive this dialogue between the Yemeni parties to look like? Is there anything in particular that you would, love to see in this dialogue, whether in terms of ideas, in terms of actors, in terms of principles, anything at all? Let's begin with Nadwa.
So we're talking about an ideal scenario, which I think it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. But let's talk about what should happen in order for Yemen to transform from conflict to peace. Okay, through peaceful negotiations, which is the very ideal tool for peace. So I think two things should happen in order for peace to be achieved. One, all the leaders who are involved in the war, in instigating the war, in continuing the war, and profiting from the war should be sidelined. They should not be part of any future negotiations because they're not interested in peace. They will not be interested in peace. And if they're part of a negotiation, then they will do whatever it takes to obstruct the negotiations. Because as Mohammed said, they have so much to lose if the war ends, and they're profiting from the war. So I think these leaders should be sidelined. Hadi should be sidelined. Abdul Malik al-Houthi should be sidelined. Key Houthi leaders should be sidelined. And then the dialogue should involve more Yemenis than it did in the past. So in this case, it shouldn't be Houthis and Hadi's government and only the STC. It should be expanded. It should be all the other actors that have a stake. So we have, for example, we have all the other southern groups as well. We have the West Coast forces. We have the Tihama, people who have always been very not only oppressed but also exploited for hundreds of years. All these people should be around the table and should have an equal say with the other main parties. Of course, women and youth and all of that. And we can't just bring these people as, just to show that there is representation and inclusion. It has to be genuine participation, and they have to have a say. I mentioned that the National Dialogue Conference failed, and it failed because one, it was a recipe from outside. It was not really a Yemeni process. Somebody brought it, and then the Yemenis had to do it because Westerners insisted on it. But at the same time, also, the parties who had the power and the influence and the decision making were not really supporting the national dialogue. They were negotiating using their traditional negotiation methods, which is war, outside the National Dialogue Conference, and that's why it collapsed. So moving forward, these main actors, these traditional actors, elite, they need to go. They cannot be part of any future negotiation because they're spoilers, and they will continue to be spoilers, and they have no right to be part of a national process. The second part is regional actors and international actors. Any future dialogue should be Yemeni, and international actors and regional actors should not intervene. They can help, they can support, but they cannot dictate. They cannot come up with a recipe and tell Yemenis, oh, here's what the dialogue should look like, because Yemenis have their own ways of negotiations. And this is a country that is very rich in negotiations and conflict resolution and peace building, more than any other Western country. So let the process be led by Yemenis, designed by Yemenis, run by Yemenis, and support, as much as Yemenis tell you what kind of support they need. The problem is, I think this is also unrealistic because regional actors and international actors have interest in Yemen, will continue to have interest in Yemen. They will want to intervene, and they will want to sway the negotiations in a way that preserves their interests. But if they really want peace, if they really want Yemen to move forward, if they want the war to end and Yemenis to achieve sustainable peace, they do need to step aside and let Yemenis resolve their own issues amongst them the way they think it can be done. So these are the two things I think should happen in order for any future negotiations to succeed.
Thank you very much, Nadwa. You highlighted a set of very important points, actually. One is, the inclusivity of the peace process, as in to include, voices from the civil society, from marginalized groups, from regions that have been exploited, such as in Hadramaut and Tahama, and so the rest of the country, of course. You mentioned also, ways to sort of sideline and disengage the first class or the ruling elite from the political process, be it, the current leadership of the legitimate government or the militias or etc., etc. And that's very important. What comes to my mind, actually, is we look back at the Arab Spring uprising. When we had the Gulf Initiative, Saleh should have been ousted out. He should have been given a holiday to go in the Caribbean and just chill and do whatever. But that didn't happen. And he was, one of the seeds for the next round of the multifaceted conflict that we see today, allied with the Houthis, allowed them in and all this complexity. So the point that you mentioned is very important. It just now we have just more players to actually sideline, and with that come more challenges, actually. And then you talked also about the level of international support in a technical term, not in a way that actually owns the process. The process, as you said, should be owned by Yemenis and among Yemenis, because it is their country, it is the peace that they want, but should receive the genuine support that helps them develop and recapture the country to the way they wish. And all of this good. The reason why I said, if the dialogue would be tomorrow and all obstacles would be removed and the situation would be ideal, because, war would have to take its time. Usually conflicts are resolved in two ways: an outright military victory or a negotiated political settlement. And we, as you said, Yemen is rich with traditional mechanisms to address conflict at a local level and not so at a national level. With that, I go to you, Mr. Mohammed, to talk about, the kind of peace you the kind of dialogue you actually imagine. What could it look like? What are the necessary principles to actually have a dialogue among Yemenis?
I think ceasefire is important, as a step for any negotiation, but it should not be a ceasefire for the sake of ceasefire. It should be a ceasefire that leads to genuine, peace process, a sustainable peace process that brings sustainable peace to Yemen, rather than just a temporary situation where we have another round of conflict, which has been the case. I mean, every some years we have this kind of conflict, because of lack of this kind of sustainability of peace. So this is one of the most important things, is that all parties, they should come to a realization that, military action is not going to lead anywhere. When they feel that they can live together and we can realize, we have the right to live together, they can move forward for any peace process. But still, as long as they are still, having the feeling that they can control and they can defeat using the military force, which has not been the case. For 7 years now, we will not move forward. So they have first to acknowledge that, we are all Yemenis, we have to live in peace, we have to recognize the right of each other, we have to come into a common ground, agreement, which is that there should be a ceiling that under which we can live together. Otherwise, if you have a feeling that you can rule using your divine dogma or your Salafist dogma, or this is Magusi, this is Salafist, this is Dawash. We will not reach any point. So this is one of the most important thing. The other thing is that, regionally wise, we should have real support from the region, and they should deal with Yemen not only as a threat, but Yemen as a partner. Yemen as a country which is in a very important strategic location, which can be an area of interest to all the countries, because we are on the Bab al-Mandab. We have a very important location. We can be a country that can be good even for the region, for the Gulf, for all these neighbors. But now, unfortunately, in the international community and even the region, they have been dealing with Yemen as a time bomb, as a threat. And this has been the case even during Saleh. So once they recognize that Yemen should enjoy peace, Yemen is a partner, Yemen is a very important country for us, then we can have the ground for moving forward towards peace. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard to move forward for any real genuine peace talks that leads to sustainable peace.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So you highlighted the importance of ceasefire, as an integral component to a comprehensive peace process that's not just urgent and then eventually vanishes or disappears, which has been seen in the past couple of years under the supervision of the United Nations. And I think that's exactly how I want to end this podcast today, that if the war is unwinnable militarily, then at least it should stop and end through, a dialogue where parties, including militias, go to talk from a position of good faith and constructive engagement for, the future of the country as a whole, and to put an end to the suffering of millions who face the consequences of the conflict inside and outside Yemen, be it Yemenis or actors from the region or even foreigners. And I think that's such a powerful note that you mentioned, both Mohammed and Nadwa. So with this discussion today with my guests, Nadwa al-Dawsari from the Middle East Institute and Mohammed Al-Qadhi, who's worked on the field as a journalist and a war reporter and an analyst as well, we highlighted a wide range of obstacles that went actually beyond my initial question of 3. They mentioned an array of obstacles that continue to shape the Yemen trajectory at the moment in military, socioeconomic, and security and humanitarian terms. But they also highlighted some of the principles that should be factored in when we talk about dialogue and the shape of dialogue that they want to see and what issues should be discussed. This has been a very rich discussion and actually dialogue with both of you. And I appreciate all the points that you mentioned and contributed to the 6th episode of Kaleidoscope, hosted by the Yemen Policy Center and funded by the German Federal Office. Thank you for joining me today here. Your guest was Ibrahim Jalal, and wish our followers an enjoyable listen. Thank you very much for your time, Nadwa and Mohammed, and we look forward to seeing you again.